Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Joy Castro. Joy, welcome to the show. Thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled.
Cool. So we're going to do something a little bit different, listeners. I'm going to read a bit about Joy from her blurb about a book, and then we're going to dive into the last phrase that she talks about. And the reason I'm doing this is I just felt that if I dove straight in, is that the word you say? Dove straight in to that topic, it wouldn't make any sense. And it's also a great introduction to Joy because she's been through some tough stuff. So I did check with Joy that she's okay to do this. So here we are. So, adopted as a baby and raised by a devout Jehovah's Witness family, Joy Castro is constantly reminded to tell the truth, no matter what the consequences. Nevertheless, Castro finds this tenet to be the most violated. Here, in her very own truth book, Castro bears witness to a childhood lost but a life regained. Castro's parents divorce after her father is excommunicated for smoking. Excommunicated for smoking, yeah. She is 12 when her mother marries a brother in the church who, though exhibiting an impeccable public persona, is violent and controlling at home. For 2 years, Joy does not grow at all. In fact, she loses 16 pounds in response to the physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse she suffers at his hands. Her battered mother does nothing to protect her, nor does the church. She is sustained by humour, books, and her protective love for her younger brother until their daring escape. This courageous personal account looks freshly at the disturbing effects of religious hypocrisy and the resilience of the human spirit. Wow. So my life has been a cakewalk compared to Joy's. Wow, Joy. It was the last bit that really got me, because it's kind of my fascination, and I thought it would be lovely to explore it with you. So the last phrase that you use on that truth book blurb is the resilience of the human spirit. So what do you mean by that?
Oh, thank you so much, Simon. So that is a copy from my publisher, right? Like that's what they wrote to publicize the book and let people know about it. But I'm definitely on board with the whole concept of the resilience of the human spirit. I do deeply believe that we're here to grow and to heal and to love and to create. And so I'm very invested in all of those things for all people. I'm invested in our safety, our happiness, our kindness, humor, definitely humor, and our love for one another and how that can save us. So I think that we are quite strong, and I certainly wouldn't wish for anyone to have been tested and the way that my experience tested me. But I know that many people survive worse and go on to be productive, loving, kind-hearted, sane, um, beautiful people in the world. And sometimes living through really hard things can just deepen our compassion and our empathy. So, so I'm on board for
Yeah,
growth. Yeah.
yeah, you're on board for growth. Yeah, um, it was really poignant for me, actually, the abuse thing. One of my first girlfriends told me, I don't know to talk about this stuff, but she told me that she'd been abused by her uncle, and she told me after the first time we'd made love.
Oh, that's
And
wonderful.
so I'm going back 34, like 35, like 37 years. I can't remember exactly what it was. And it struck me as I'd never, like I'd never heard of anybody going through that. And yeah, what do you say to that? So I think that's maybe why it got me. And I do sometimes talk on the show about my most important mentor, who was abused by a dad when she was a kid, when she was really little, and I talk about that as the epitome. And I used to, talking about humor, just lighten it up a bit. We were talking earlier on about mispronunciation of Yosemite. We were talking about national parks,
Right.
and because my wife's in a national park with one of her pals here in the UK at the moment. Another word that I have really badly mispronounced is epitome, right? Which is
Oh,
epitome, right?
sure. Yes.
So when for me, Liz Ivory, Elizabeth Ivory, she's got a book out. She's got a book as well. It's called "It's Not Your Fault." She was abused by her dad, and she is the epitome of resilience, because coming back from that sort of stuff, to me, says if the it is the epitome of the human resilience, the resilience of the human spirit. Because if people can come through that, they can come through anything. It's like the yeah, the unthinkable, the unbelievable happens, and yet that kind of people grow from that. People somehow come to terms with that. People grow from that stuff. So yeah, you talked about growing, healing, loving, and creating. What's your favorite one of those?
Well, for sure, loving and creating are more fun than the very difficult, challenging work of healing and growing. Incredibly rewarding work, but I would never minimize the emotional and intellectual, cognitive effort that it takes to face severe trauma and um, learn how to heal from it. It's not natural. That whole time heals all wounds. No, not necessarily. Trauma can get stored in the body and mind for decades, and it can remain unhealed, and it can color the way we see the world. It can filter how we perceive the actions of people in our lives now, even though they may be benevolent or at least neutral. We may react as if they're dangerous or hostile, uh, critical, a potential threat. It's because our nervous systems are wired for hypervigilance once we have been traumatized. And so, learning how to unwire that response, that trauma response, and rewire it, that takes a lot of painful work. And I could never have done it without the help of professional therapists. So I always recommend that. I know that in some cultures and for some individuals, there's shame surrounding needing help, as if that makes you crazy or something, right? But absolutely, I always suggest that people get the professional help they need, because ordinary people walking around are just not equipped to give that kind of help. And sometimes when we turn uh, uh, to a well-meaning friend or family member, they are not capable of helping us process trauma. They may even say or do things that make it worse or that make us withdraw further in shame. So I say, get the professional help that's necessary to do the healing work and to do the growth so that all those pent up energies that are used to cope with that stored trauma are then liberated for the far more pleasurable activities of loving and creating,
Yeah.
right? So I think they're all intertwined. I really do. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, we had a saying a long time ago. Well, one of my friends had a saying. He's a cheeky, very humorous guy,
Yeah.
um, and he used to say, "Do you remember there's a band in the '90s called New Kids on the Block? Do you remember them? I mean, what? Yeah, no. Um, this friend of mine said, "Who's who?" One of his lines was, "Who's your favourite new kid?" I don't know where he picked that up, but that popped into my head. When I said, "Which is your favourite out of Grow, Heal, and Love and Create?" Yeah, who's your favourite new kid? No, not. What have been what's been the um, what's been the shape of your healing, or the drive of your healing, or the essence of your healing that you've been through? Or
Sure.
pick a word that suits you more. I don't know whether my words.
Yeah. I mean, maybe trajectory is an important way to think about it. So I was adopted. I was given up for adoption in a closed adoption um, by a birth mother who never saw or held me. She was anesthetized throughout the procedure, and I was removed from her. I want to just sort of give the
Yeah,
arc of
yeah, go for it.
yeah, and so and then I was in the hospital for 4 days, and then I was adopted by a couple that was at that time they'd been diagnosed as infertile, and I was raised by them, and it was extremely interesting. They they had so my father was Cuban American from the um, waves of Cuban emigres that landed in Key West in the 1860s. They had gone there as part of the anti-colonial revolution against Spain. It was a 30 years war against Spain, and Key West, Florida, was the offshore rebel base for organizing this
Wow.
anti-colonial. Yeah, yeah, it was pretty cool. And this is a lost history, pretty much. There are a few historians who work on it, but in general, the public in the United States does not know about this Cuban American history. Most people are familiar with the post 1959 Cuban American history, and the waves of exiles that came after Fidel Castro's communist revolution. Anyway, so my father's family had been in Florida for about 100 years, um, and they wanted a Cuban American baby, right? So they arranged through a lawyer for a private adoption, and the lawyer guaranteed at least a Latina baby, if not Cuban American, promised, right? And so that's what the that's what I supposedly was. That's what I was purveyed as, and I was adopted. And then my parents had a difficult marriage. My adoptive parents had a difficult marriage, and by the time I was 10, their marriage had fallen apart and they were getting divorced. My mother remained a Jehovah's Witness, a devout Jehovah's Witness, and does so to this day. Um, whereas my father left the religion and uh, was not religious after that. So I ran away from home at 14. I was living with my mother and her stepfather, the abusive one that you mentioned earlier. I ran away from home at 14. 6 months later, with the help of police and the courts, we were able to get my little brother out. That was sort of a scary and dangerous time for me. And my testimony was instrumental in that. So that was a very difficult thing to do as a teenager, a young teenager. Um, but my health rebounded, and I went to university at 16. And from then on, I was completely financially and emotionally independent. Um, uh, I made many what therapists call bad decisions. I made a lot of bad life decisions, but I did get my university degree, and I had my son, who was the result of an unplanned pregnancy in college when I was 20 years old. I raised him for some years as a single mother while getting my master's and doctorate, and then I became a professor. And today I teach English, so 20th and 21st century literatures and creative writing and Latinx studies at the University of Nebraska. And and so the Truth Book was part of this trajectory of healing, writing that book, which came out in 2005. I can't believe how long it's been now, but it's a memoir, and it's been fact checked and corroborated by entities, including the New York Times. So it's like, I feel very happy about saying that that's nonfiction, and it's doing socio-political work in the world. When I was in my 20s, after I had had my son, I felt this incredibly strong compulsion to find my birth mother, right? And I know that a number of other people have said something similar, that when they have children, the overwhelming nature of that bonding experience makes them realize, or at least believe, that no one could have gone through that experience and simply forgotten them, right? So my experience of going through pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, raising my son just made me realize no one could go through those amazing, overwhelming physical, emotional, mental changes of pregnancy and birth and not have that leave a powerful memory, right? So I thought, I need to find her. And maybe I need to find him too, if the birth father knew about my existence at all. And so I signed up on a voluntary registry that was housed in Nevada and staffed by volunteers. And it took them, I think, 4 years to match up what was apparently like my paper form with the paper form of my birth mother, who had also registered as soon as she knew I had turned 18. She felt the same way, like, oh, I must try at least to get in touch. So they put us in touch based on my date of birth, the city, and the hospital, and my gender, right? And she knew those things, and that was really all we knew. And they put us in touch, and we talked on the phone. It was an overwhelmingly emotional
Yeah.
phone. And I think by that weekend, I was flying from Texas to Wisconsin to meet her. Yeah. And so I was 26 when that happened. Yeah. So um, a couple of years later, I started really looking in earnest for my birth father, because I had gotten enough information from her about that. And when I was on the verge of finding him, my birth mother disclosed to me, because she was worried that I would hear it from him and not from her. She disclosed to me the narrative that's in the prologue of the Truth Book, uh, in which the two of them drive to an industrial park and go into a warehouse and try to obtain an illegal abortion, back before those were available. And so that came as a shock, because
Wow.
for 2 years or so she had been saying, oh, I wanted you so much, I wanted you so much, and then like to learn that was like, oh, okay, okay, is very reasonable and understandable, but it came as a strange blow. So I learned that, and then I did meet my birth father and had several conversations with him. I think I actually met him in person 3 times. Um, And getting to know, and I went to family reunions on both sides, so I got to meet both extended families as well, and was in serious therapy, like getting support for the incredible weirdness of it all, right? The emotional intensity was just beyond words. And so then I wrote the Truth Book, and that came out after I had earned tenure at the small college where I was teaching at the time, and that came out, and being public about both. Really, it was more about the abuse that people were shocked by. I mean, I don't think the adoption part of it was that compelling to most readers unless they themselves were adopted, right? It was the adoptees that were like, "Oh my goodness, yeah, you really go there."
Yeah.
Um, but it's sort of like going public with both of those issues changed my life. It really did. Like, first writing it changed my life. I wrote the whole book in 3 weeks at a little writers retreat up in Minnesota. I did nothing else really except eat meals for those 3 weeks, and then I put it away. I wrote it longhand in these two notebooks, put it away for 9 months while I was teaching, and then took it out again and looked at it to see if I thought that it could have any potential, either artistic merit, because I love literature. So
Yeah.
as you know, as we've talked before, I study like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. So I was interested in art shaping, but I was also interested in, does this have socio-political value in the world? Can it help people? And I thought that it was sufficient. So I did, I typed it up and I sent it to an agent. The agent took it right away. It got published very quickly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so how did the book help you in terms of your healing stuff?
Yeah, the writing of it was incredibly cathartic. I know that a lot of creative writing teachers don't like to focus on writing as catharsis, therapy, or healing because they want the public to take it very seriously as art making. And I do take it very seriously as an aesthetic craft. But also, I have to say that we know from research on narrative therapy and trauma. We know that when people who have been tortured, who've been abused, who've gone through natural catastrophes, we know that when they can shape the account of what happened to them into a coherent narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, then their trauma symptoms begin to recede. It's the most extraordinary thing. Uh, Narrative therapy is huge. It actually works because the way that trauma gets encoded in our brains is in flashes, sounds, smells, fragments. It's really fragmented, and then it gets stored in our bodies in muscular gripping, tension, and so on. And when we can put it into words in a way has that has cause and effect, right? This begins to heal us and bring us from a world of silence and the incapacity to share that story into a social space where our experiences are shareable in narrative, shareable in language, and then our trauma symptoms, our PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, exaggerated startle response, all of it, the gamut, right? Hallucinations, like auditory hallucinations, those things begin to fade and ultimately heal. So the writing of the book did a lot of those things for me. Then the recounting of those things verbally in therapy sessions with a trained counselor similarly helped, right? Not just writing to a silent page, but to a human being that could catch the intensity. And then going on book tour with this Whoa, I was so nervous, Simon. Like I would tremble before I would go out onto a stage and read from that book. I was so scared. Um, you know that you're going to be judged for the quality of the writing, as well as for your actions and choices that you took. And then you're also exposing um, the shame. And it's a crazy thing, but this is how it functions in the human psyche. When people abuse or violate us, we internalize that as our own shame, when in actuality the moral shame should be that of the perpetrators, right? But that's not how it works, right? The abused people internalize that shames and the wound, and the like. If you go back to adoption, the trauma of the abandonment wound, that sort of primal wound that leaves us feeling out of place, ill at ease, unwanted, and ashamed, not knowing why we don't quite fit, not knowing why we feel alienated, different, estranged. That shame as well shouldn't be ours, but rather should be that of a social structure and economic and political structures that make it difficult for individuals and families to do what they really want. So whether that's, terminating a pregnancy or keeping a child, or having an open relationship with adoptive parents, so many times there are geopolitical and economic structures in place that prevent that. The shame should belong to those structures, not to the individuals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, there's so much there. I'm yeah, the first thing that popped into my head was, I mentioned this lady, Liz, Liz Liz Ivory, Elizabeth Ivory. I mentioned her earlier on. So she runs the Ministry of Inspiration with her husband, and they've been running it for so many years. And I went on one of their retreats in 2009, and during that retreat, the 8 of us, I think there was, including Liz and Richard, they were we spent the first, it's a 5-day retreat, we spent probably the first 3 days sharing our stories in like a group setting. So when I watch in American cop shows, there's always one that's in Alcoholics Anonymous. Every cop show has an alcoholic. And they all sit around together and they kind of share the stuff. It was a bit like that, but we shared our stories and how we'd felt as and we did it. So it was like a spoken autobiography, really, memoir. And we got everything out, and we got all the shame out. And one of the shames I had, and it links into. See, I'm ashamed to talk about it. I before we started recording, I said I'm going to read, but I'm not very good at reading out. So when I was 7, I read at the front of class, 6 or 7. I read at the front of class with my English teacher, with my class teacher, right, in elementary school. And I needed to go to the loo. And I didn't tell her. I didn't feel like I could tell her. I felt I had to keep on reading this book. It was The Borrowers. I'll never forget it. And I peed my pants. I peed my pants, and like shame around that. And some kid reminded me of it a bit, like later on in like I was 11, 12, and it's just like, getting this stuff out there, getting the stuff, getting the dark stuff out into the open. It's kind of not as scary. It's not as scary as anymore. And I'm going to inject some humor into this because obviously it's you said it here. So Richard and Liz that work together. Richard is a public speaker and inspirational guy, and he's partner Liz is more of a coachy type person. He says when he comes on stage, he talks about how scared he is, and talks about the number of times the number of poos he's had to have before he comes on stage.
That's fun. This is interesting, isn't it? I mean, the connection with the body and how, how the body and its its rebellion against social norms can end up being a kind of source of shame or a source of humor and connection,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. This is interesting. And the way, so I think I told you that I went to um, school in England for a few years early in life, from like age 3 to age 6. And I had to go up. I didn't tell you this, but so this was I think it's Ascot Heath
yeah,
Elementary or something like that's the name of the little school that I went to. Super strict uniforms, public school. It was very posh and very rigid. And I had to go read to the teacher in the front of the room, Miss McLeod, and I just worshipped Miss McLeod. And then, of course, when we got to the end of our readers, we had to go to the headmistress's office, Miss Creasy, and she was terrifying. And we had to read to her, and then if we did it properly, we would get a sweetie and be sent back to do the next reader. I don't know if that's but like in the United States, children do not read to their teachers, and we do very little reading aloud at all. And I do think that um, it prepared me very well to give readings as an author. I get nervous as all hell, but I do give a good reading, right? People say that I do a very good reading. And so I think it comes from that early experience. But I will also say that Miss McLeod, one time, this is funny. Okay, we have like bathroom shame stories. I went to the loo and in and I was looking under the doors of the stalls to see which ones were empty so I could go to the stall and use the bathroom. And Miss McLeod came in and she slapped my thigh, which was bare because of the little short skirt,
yeah,
slapped my thigh really hard and she said, "I know what you're doing, you filthy girl." Like as if I were like voyeuristically watching other children pee or something. And I felt like I went hot with shame. I felt so like bad and evil. And it was like all I needed to do was go to the bathroom, you know? But like this regime of
yeah.
shaming by adults around really natural bodily functions. Like how bizarre is that if you think about it? Like, having been a mother, having very lovingly potty trained my kid with no drama and no fuss. It's like we naturally at some point just, stop using our diapers. You know, it's like, why is there all this heavy coding around? Okay, we've gone far afield, Simon. This is
Yeah.
hilarious. But I mean, it is strange, and the shame and the intensity around bodies, and I do think in some ways it does connect to adoption and you know pregnancy, unplanned pregnancy, or pregnancy that violates social norms. So the mother shouldn't keep the child, right, to accord with the social conventions of her class or caste. So I think there's something kind of profoundly connected about all this, like bringing all of these things into shareable verbal public discourse removes some of their toxic power.
Yeah.
It really does. It makes it safer and kinder.
I'd like to just dive in a bit of detail, if and if nothing comes to mind, that's fine. Yeah, but have you do you remember any particular healing moments on that trajectory, like instances where something happened, something clicked, something was released, something healed?
I do. I was working with a really wonderful counselor in a small town in Indiana, and I thank her actually in the acknowledgments of the Truth Book. And I was in my 30s at that time, my early 30s, and I had not ever learned to cry. Like obviously as a baby I cried, as a child I did cry, and then at some point I just stopped and like shoved it all inside, all of the pain. And I was, I guess I could say, I was really terrified to start crying. And this is a fear that I think is shared by many survivors of trauma. It's so overwhelming what you carry inside, and you know it's overwhelming, and you're afraid that if you start to cry, to really cry, not just a few leaky tears, but like gut cry, sob cry, you're afraid you'll never stop. I was literally afraid that I would die of crying, that there was so much sorrow and pain, like just locked in my soul, that if I started, I thought I will just go insane. I will never come back from that. So, like I ran away at 14, was pretty much on my own from 16, had a baby at 20. I was like powering through, right? Like just muscling through. And then 3 degrees with no financial or emotional support. Like I just was a workaholic. And I think that I worked in order to stave off the the pain of having to deal with what I knew was inside, right? And to be a good mother. I mean, like obviously I went through therapy on how to be a good mother. Like I really wanted to not reproduce the hellish conditions of my youth. So and I feel like, okay, I can do this. I can be a really great mother. Okay, I can be a really great student. I can prove myself. I can be productive. I can be positive, right? But in therapy with this counselor, she just kept encouraging, kept making it a safe place. And then one day, man, whew, like the
Gosh,
dam just
gosh,
burst. It burst, yeah. And like for 45 minutes, I was just sobbing. And like she brought the trash can over the rubbish bin. Yeah. So because she thought that I was going to throw up, she thought I was going to be physically sick. I was crying so hard and from such a deep, like abdominal level, just so physicalized this sorrow. And the thing is, and I really at that point it was just too intense to not cry anymore. Like I just gave into it. And I really did. At that point, I was like, "Can I swear on here, Simon?
yeah,
No or yes?"
yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, at that point, I was just sort of like, "Fuck it. I don't care if I do die. I don't care if I do go insane. I cannot control this anymore. I cannot keep this all inside anymore." So that was my attitude. It was like a fuck it attitude, right? Like I'll just die of grief. I'll just die of sorrow right here. Um, and the miraculous thing was that of course I didn't, right? And those endless minutes of I want to say unbearable pain, but it was bearable. Those moments of pain ended, right? And my body exhausted itself, my psyche exhausted itself, and I felt like I had washed up on a shore, you know? Like I had been shipwrecked and I had washed up on a safe shore of like exhausted relief, and everything was different. Like colors were brighter. I could breathe more easily and more deeply. Like my body felt different. Like it was terrifying to do it, terrifying to let go in that way. And it gave me the faith and understanding that I could. And so I cried like that probably 5 or 6 more times. And every time symptoms of PTSD would recede, they would ebb. So the nightmares left. I had been having panic attacks that I thought were heart attacks. One took me to the emergency room at Yale University where I was supposed to be doing academic research. I thought I was dying, and it was a panic attack. I didn't know what that was at the time, and there wasn't as much in the media about panic attacks back then. I guess this was like in the late 1990s. I had no idea what was happening. So these symptoms in the early 2000s, when I was in therapy, they began to recede, and it was so illuminating, so incredible. I felt like I had been machining my way through life as a good robot, and suddenly I was back as a member of the feeling human race again, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah, yeah. So that was a really profound moment. That was a profound moment. And I would like to also thank my lovely former husband, who was there with me for that process and was incredibly supportive. And he would do this thing. Um, it was amazingly loving. He would sit behind me uh, on the bed, and I would sit like in his embrace, but not facing him because I was too ashamed of what I would look like as I cried, like ugly cry, like sobbing and, mucus coming out of your nose and like your face all red and, funny faces that you make when you cry that are not attractive in the way you want to be seen by your romantic partner. He would just put his arms around me, and I would cry, and it was the most incredible safe feeling of being held. And I would cry like that heavy sobbing, gut cry. And it was just the most generous thing for him to do. It was incredible for him to be like a container, a crucible, a safe holder of that wrenching sorrow that did not approximate anything in his life, but he was an empathetic and compassionate enough person that he could just reach outside of himself to do that. And it was just incredibly healing. I don't know. I imagine that kind of human generosity is happening all over the world all the time, that people are loving each other in that tender and accepting way. Because I don't think that our species would have lasted if that, given all the cruelties that we also know are happening around the world all the time. I don't think that our species would have endured had many, many people not been generous in that way. And so I really want to thank him. He was very present for me and just very deeply loving and compassionate. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Did I tell you about my two crying, a couple of crying moments when we spoke last time?
No, you did not.
So yeah, no, one's a cry moment, one's a non-cry moment. Yeah, so I was in a therapist's chair, and she asked me about my search for my birth mother, and oh yeah, I went yeah, a picture of my birth mother came into my head. I'm sorry if you've heard this before, listeners. I'll try and tell it slightly differently this time. A picture of my birth mother popped into my head outside the therapist's room. And I opened the door. This is all in my head, right? I don't know what she did next, but I felt rejection from her in my head, right? And I froze in terror. And then I went red hot in anger. And it was like, I'm not going to let this fear ruin my life. And so I restarted my search. I paused my search for my birth mother, and I restarted it on the basis of that. Now, I don't know whether the therapist wanted to, what she was going for, yeah, that was my extreme reaction to the therapist. And then,
Wow.
so a few months later, or a year later, I'm not sure which, I got the adoption file. And in the adoption file, there was a letter from my birth mother to the social worker about the teddy bear. So I told you about the teddy bear and the fact that I was 40 when I found out that the teddy bear was from my birth mother. Yeah. So 8 years later, I found the story. This letter to the social worker told the story of the teddy bear. So the letter was 4 days after my birth mum had taken me to the adoption agency. I was about 4 weeks old, 4 or 5 weeks old. And the letter says that thanks the social worker for her help, and says that she'd wanted to buy a teddy, to stop at the store on the way to the adoption agency and buy a teddy bear for me. So I had something from her. But the traffic had been bad. So she hadn't been, and she didn't want to be late for the meeting, right? So again, social norms. She doesn't want to be, she doesn't want to be late. She doesn't want to be, put people out. And this, and then there's then she asks the social worker if they will ask my parents if she were to buy a bear, would they accept it and give it to me?
Wow.
And the letter is full of that power dynamic an authority that you were talking about, you talked about in passing, and her desperation. And as I read this letter, the tears, they weren't, my tears were better than yours. I wasn't snotting or anything like that, right? Competitive crying competition. I'm glad you like that. Just a bit of wisdom in the moment. So the tears were cascading down my face. But you beat me on 45 minutes. These only lasted about, 2 minutes or something like that. But the tears washed away in the same way that the tears washed away some of your trauma. The tears washed away my intense 20 seconds, 30 seconds of anger to her that I'd had in my life.
Yeah.
I came up with a metaphor for this, and I'm sorry if you've heard this one before. Listen. So I told you that I'm a swimmer, right? So at this time of year, my pool sometimes shuts and I have to go to a different pool. It's a big pool. It's like a 50, 60 yard long pool. It's one big pool. And there's a wall, a barrier lifts from the base of the swimming pool to divide it into two smaller swimming pools.
Okay.
So reading that letter, reading the letter was like the barrier collapsing. So the barrier represents my anger and my trauma towards my birth mother, and me and my birth mum, Patricia Joan Flower, are the two separate pools. Okay. And then we became one. I was connected with her. We were as one, not two separate pools, just not two separate beings, one being.
Yeah.
It was like a warm bath of love.
Nice. Right? Yeah.
And I felt that before. I walked into a hotel suite, and we were a lot of people that had been on the retreat course that I've been on, and people that are thinking of going on the course. This is when Richard talks about how many poos he's had before he's come on the stage. Yeah, it's this guy. So as I walked into the room, they're projecting pictures of the people that were on the retreat at the end of the week, right? So they've arrived on Monday, they finish on Friday, and as I walked into the room, up comes this picture of me, Richard and Liz, and all the other people, the other 5 people that were on the retreat, and I felt that love, I felt that connection, I felt the relief that I'd felt when I shared my story and when everybody else had shared their story. And, I had this similar to you, that kind of buried myself in my workaholic thing.
Yeah.
So I shared some about that on the course, and shared stuff about, them not good enough for the adoption thing and the adoption primal wound stuff and that. And as we all shared our stories, none of these other people were adoptees.
Mm.
And none of them thought that they were good enough either. And
Oh, right.
we were as one, we put our trauma, shared our trauma, we put it on the table metaphorically, and shared the shit we'd been through.
Yeah.
And we were as one, released free of that. And that's what love is. That love is that absence of difference, isn't it? Absence of difference.
Or the acknowledgement of difference, but the acceptance and complete embrace, right? I'm really interested in this question. Um, can we love across difference? Because, of course, difference divides human beings all around the world, right? Um, a one of my more recent books, Flight Risk, is really exploring that question. Can we love across difference? How can we love across difference when people are divided by race, class, gender, all kinds of things like that, and then trauma, not being traumatized? Like, how do we do that? How do we? And I think what you're saying about this, um, the Ministry of Inspiration group, is part of that. We share our stories, we embrace the stories of others without judgment, but rather with compassion and understanding. And then we feel the connection that we all crave and that as human beings we're wired for, right? It's a survival mechanism for us to be connected to one another, to trust one another. But so much about the way our contemporary lives are structured mitigates against that kind of connection. I mean, to just say like, oh, capitalism, right? Like this competitive structure where workaholism is actively rewarded all the time, right? Where performing how hard we work is part of many cultures, right? And performing how hard we work at the expense of rest, at the expense of family, at the expense of nature, at the expense of love. You know, when that is rewarded, not just financially, but socially, right? It's affirmed often. Um, in social situations. You ask people, I don't know about you, but I work at the university, and you ask people how they are, and they say, "Oh, really busy," right? Like
It's a badge of
before
honor. It's a badge of honor.
of honor. It's a badge of honor. I'm working myself into the ground, so I'm a good enough person. And I think that, capitalism and maybe other economic and political structures as well, they mobilize that shame, that hidden shame of not being good enough. They mobilize that to make us sort of work and work and work to earn the stamp of approval of our superiors in the hierarchy. And it takes incredible work to refuse and unlearn that structure, and to locate the source of authority with the self, with the body, with loved ones. So yeah, I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying about that group, and that's really beautiful. I thought of something else, Simon, when you were asking about um, what what it did in terms of my healing to publish the Truth Book. And I had started to talk about touring with it, you know, like going out on book tour to different cities and giving readings at universities and bookstores and so on. I had just only talked about the nervousness, like the butterflies and the, yeah, but also the crazy thing, and it speaks to exactly what you're saying. The connection that happened was electrifying. Like I would read passages from the book, and afterwards, people would come up to me and say, that was my story too, and I've never told anyone. You know, and people would have tears in their eyes. They would take my hand in their hands. You know, sometimes people would embrace me, which is a little, you know, like, whoa, hey, we're strangers, you're hugging me, okay? And then, you know, I was like, okay, I'm gonna melt that inherent reserve that I feel, like a lack of trust, a bit of fear. I'm gonna melt that because I want to be open and responsive. And so when I did, it was just amazing. And people, like, I would get emails from people who were reading it in their book clubs, and they would say things like, I have been friends with these people for 10 years, and I never told them that I was abused or that I was adopted. And because we read your book and I saw how warm and accepting they were, I told them about my experience, and it changed the dynamic in my book club. So, like, total strangers were writing that. So it's sort of like it was a ripple effect of human connection. And that was such a beautiful gift. I mean, I was so scared to expose those super, you know, private, shameful, blah, blah things about my life. And then instead of the horrible punishment that as a formerly abused person you think you're going to get for exposing that, right? Because it's secrecy, right? Adoption in many families and societies is the big secret, because it's about transgressive sexuality that must forever be hidden, right, and concealed and obscure. uh, Adoption can be um, cloaked in secrecy. Certainly abuse in a domestic violence situation is cloaked in secrecy. You're told as a child, if you tell anyone, you know, I'll kill you, right? That's what our stepfather said to us, and it was just terrifying, you know. So to break that veil of shame, I'm not sure that metaphor works really well. To break a veil, to rend the veil of shame, to rip the veil of shame, that was really scary. It's so taboo, right? But then when you do it, you're placed into connection with human beings who've gone through something maybe not the same, but comparable, similar, different but connected, right? It opens up this web of connections that hadn't been there before. It hadn't been accessible to you before. So I'm all in favor. Tell your story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That feels like a great place to stop. I don't think I can top that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, that's good because I got to go to the bathroom anyway. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for
Thank you.
having
Yeah.
talk and for sharing, just for sharing
Yeah.
yourself with me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So we're going to say goodbye, listeners. But I'm just you're not going to go, right? Just want to have a couple of words with you after before you go to the bathroom. Thanks a lot, listeners, and check out Joy's book. You know, as always, check out the show notes, links to her website, her socials, and the book. And we'll speak to you again very soon. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Joy. That was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.